On behalf of the Center for International Conflict Resolution at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the Alvaro de Soto Conversation Series. This evening's discussion with Ambassador Chester Crocker on challenges in the field of mediation is the seventh in the Alvaro de Soto Conversation Series, and we are very grateful to our guests for their presence this evening. The conversation will be followed by a question and answer session, and after that we welcome you to join us for a reception in the lobby. And before we begin, I'd like to welcome Professor Dirk Salomons, who will provide some introductory remarks. Dr. Salomons is a senior lecturer in international and public affairs at CIPA. He is also co-director of the Human Rights and Humanitarian Policy Concentration and director of the international organization Specialization at CIPA. Prior to joining CIPA faculty in 2002, Dr. Salomons served as managing partner at Praxis Group, an international management consulting firm. In addition, Dr. Salomons served for over 25 years in a wide range of management, peace-building, and policy advisory functions in several organizations within the United Nations system. Dr. Salomons.
Thank you, Jessica. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this conversation between Alvaro de Soto and Chester Crocker. I'd like you to imagine a fireplace in the background. A fire blazing, logs crackling, maybe the setting of a book-lined library, somewhat dimmer lights than the current glare. Imagine also that the portrait of Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, displayed in the back here, were to hang above the fireplace, gently observing the proceedings as the father of peacekeeping. The conversation that you are about to be part of is exactly that, a conversation. It's not an interview between a skilled prober and a celebrity, but it's an exchange between two people who have much in common. It's an encounter between two diplomats who have been major players on the world stage, outstanding mediators in many conflicts. Now, later in life, they'll be reflecting on the meaning or the relevance of their work, on lessons learned. For most of you in the audience, the 70s and 80s of the previous century are history, but some of us have been there. They were the years that the major global empire, the last global empire, imploded in slow motion. The years that the Soviet Union, the hallowed adversary of the West, lost its grip. A period of vicious proxy wars, ranging from the Middle East and Africa to Latin America and the far ends of Asia. This period came to an end, and largely a negotiated end. Two of the leading mediators of that period are in the room. One who represented the United Nations, one who represented the United States. Both made history. Let me welcome Alvaro de Soto and Chester Crocker, our guests this evening. We're privileged to have them both in our midst. As Professor de Soto will introduce Professor Crocker, let me introduce de Soto. It's like a Russian Matryoshka doll. Introduction, 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 introduction. Alvaro de Soto began his career as a Peruvian diplomat, serving at his country's missions to the UN in New York and Geneva, participating in the UN Law of the Sea Conference from its earliest preparatory phases to the adoption of the Law of the Sea, the Convention of 1982. He was also the Group of 77's chief negotiator for the regime of the deep sea bed. He then became special assistant to Javier Pérez de Cuellar, immediately joining Pérez de Cuellar's efforts to defuse the conflict in the South Atlantic over the Falklands, also known as Malvinas Islands. His 25-year career in the UN Secretariat spanned the terms of 3 Secretaries General. He served for 13 years in the Secretary General's office and for 5 years as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. He conducted the 1990-91 negotiations that led to the Comprehensive Peace Accords, which ended the war in El Salvador. He was the UN Special Envoy for Myanmar, 1995 to 1999. He mediated the 1999 to 2004 negotiations of the Cyprus problem, which led to parallel referendums on the Comprehensive UN Settlement Plan. He was Special Representative for the Western Sahara, 2003-2005, and he left the UN after 2 years in Jerusalem, 2005-2007, in Jerusalem and Gaza, as the Chief UN Envoy for the Arab-Israeli conflict. Among current affiliations, he is a member of the Global Leadership Foundation and a senior fellow at the Ralph Bunche Institute in New York. Since 2011, he has led a master's-level seminar course on post-Cold War conflict resolution in the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for that introduction. Chester Crocker is the James Schlesinger Professor of Strategic Studies at Georgetown University, and he is the president of the Crocker Group, a consultancy on strategic and negotiation issues. But neither of those two tell you the reason why I've asked him to come here today. His experience is so rich and varied that it's very difficult, in fact, to encapsulate him in one or two words or titles. I mean, I'd like to call him a historian or a diplomat or a scholar, but none of them quite does it. His career has included service at the National Security Council rather early on, and later on, of course, as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the Reagan administration, and we'll be coming back to that. But the bulk of his academic career after studies at Ohio State and at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University has been spent at Georgetown University. The reason why I've asked him to come here is because I'm particularly struck by certain fields of work that are relevant to the subject today, and in fact deeply relevant. The first was his work as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the Reagan administration, where he played a central role, perhaps the central role, as the architect of the policy, which was not uncontroversial at the time, that led to withdrawal of Cuban and all foreign troops from Angola and opened the door to the self-determination. Is this working? To the self-determination of Namibia. I'll be coming back to that in a moment. The other role, which is where I first met Chet, was when he was chairman of the board of the United States Institute of Peace, a position that he held for many years. He's still a member of the board, though no longer the chairman. But he plays there a particularly relevant role as the lead editor of a team of editors, together with Fen Osler-Hampson and Pamela All, of several indispensable books on conflict resolution and management. One of the common threads that runs through these books, quite apart from everything else, even before opening them, is snappy titles. Titles like Herding Cats, a book to which I had the honor to contribute a chapter, Leashing the Dogs of War. None quite so good, of course, as the title of his own book on his accomplishments in southern Africa, High Noon in Southern Africa, Making Peace in a Rough Neighborhood. They don't get better than that, titles. And they actually describe the things aptly. Now, we could have had a conversation on a number of subjects, and in fact, when I first set out a few weeks ago to chat, here's some idea in a few paragraphs of the issues that I'd like to discuss with you. He said, fine, so long as we can have 5 conversations during the course of the semester. A lot of business that could have been conducted in such conversations. We are, of course, here today to talk about a subject which is not exactly narrow, contemporary challenges facing the field of mediation. But in order to warm to the subject, I would like to ask you, Chet, after welcoming you most warmly, you are, as a scholar practitioner, and the one who is doing the welcoming is perhaps a practitioner scholar, and new to the second, as you know. But before we get to the present, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions that are related in particular to the feat of removing foreign troops from Angola and allowing for the independence of Namibia, which is the main, or at least your first claim to fame and well-deserved prestige. Now, looking back to that period, the early 80s, as you make very clear in your book and other writings and interviews on the subject, you came with a notion that the efforts that had been put underway and given a framework in Resolution 435 of the Security Council, which was sort of the blueprint leading to Namibian independence, existed, but that it wasn't going anywhere. And in part because it was not dealing with an issue which was crucial to South Africa. And if I'm distorting what you were saying, please correct me, and I'll give you the floor shortly. This was, of course, the Reagan administration. Now, from my Law of the Sea days, I had already become familiar, as many other people became familiar later, that the Reagan administration was not necessarily attached to mainstream thinking, that it was quite prepared to be iconoclastic, if it thought so, and it had the courage of its convictions. And it had quite an impact on the Law of the Sea, but that's the subject of another conversation, of course, if we ever get to that. But anyhow, you came and at the United Nations, the mainstream thinking was that you didn't engage South Africa, you boycotted it. You placed sanctions on it in order to ensure that it did the right thing regarding Namibia, and that it ended apartheid, and of course that it stopped meddling in other countries in the region. You certainly did not engage them. It was boycott. It was all about. Now, you said no, this is the wrong approach. That you've got to engage them and give them some sort of an interest in complying with all that it should comply with in order to achieve the objective that was desirable. And in the process, you not only engaged with South Africa, and at that time, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that almost any country that had relations with South Africa, in the eyes of many at the United Nations, or certainly of many African countries, was somehow suspect of being collaborating with horrendous policies. But you also engaged in the process with Cuba, not exactly the United States' closest friend. In fact, a country with whose regime the U.S. had serious difficulties for many years. And you were therefore going against the grain outside and going against the grain inside. How are you able to pull this off, Chet?
Well, Alvaro, thank you very much for that warm welcome and for those kind words. In preparation for engaging constructively with Alvaro de Soto, I just came back from a week in Peru. So I needed to get warmed up to the subject, and so I feel well prepared, having had 6 straight days of ceviche, and wonderful. It's great to be here and to be the 7th of your victims in your series of conversations with mediators. It's interesting the way you frame it, because I think it's fair to say that in 1981 there were not many people in the executive branch of the U.S. who would have thought of themselves as mediators. Mediation, real men don't mediate, might have been the mantra. And I repeatedly, during the course of the 80s, and it was a long tour, 8.5 years to get this job done, would be asked questions by colleagues in the Foreign Service. What side are we on? You're carrying water on both shoulders. What are you doing? Well, the answer, of course, is that we are on our side. We're on the American side. And if we are successful, it'll be the best possible outcome for all the people who live in the region. Because what we represent is a political answer to all the region's conflicts, as distinguished from our global adversary, which represents a military answer to all those conflicts. So it was an interesting time. And we took flack from both sides, as you indicate. We took flack for engaging with the MPLA regime in Angola, described in a lot of conservative press at the time as Marxist puppets of Moscow, which on occasion was the way they behaved, to say nothing of Cuba. And on the other side, we took a lot of flack for engaging constructively with the white regime in South Africa. The short answer to your question is that Resolution 435, which was the UN plan negotiated by our predecessors in 1978, which was a transition plan for Namibia's independence, was a great plan. The only problem with it didn't have a hope in hell of being implemented. The South Africans were in complete control of the territory, a territory larger than Texas, of which not a single square inch had been liberated. So, to be practical, if you wanted to get the South African cooperation, there had to be something a little bit more balanced than the package that was on the table. In addition, from the standpoint of American national interests, we had 2 objectives: ending Africa's last colonial situation. I don't necessarily use that terminology in describing the Western Sahara, but you may have a different view, Alvaro. And secondly, ending the presence of Cuban combat forces in Africa. So we had 2 objectives, and both those objectives would serve the interests of the region. So what we did, which was controversial, as you indicate, was to link these 2 things together. Not letting the Cubans define the time sequence and not letting the South Africans define the time sequence. And it spent years getting them to accept the principle. So linkage was one of the things that we did. The second thing we did was to come up with a series of principles about how linkage could work in practice in the interests of everybody. And it's a technique that I call focusing on the principles of the agreement at the outset and sticking with them. There were several ingredients, and I'm going to stop in a minute so you can turn the page to other topics here. I've worked in my career for 4 secretaries of state. And the one that I did this with was George Shultz, one of the great public servants of modern times in our country. He gave me and my team the air cover to be able to carry out something like this over a prolonged period of time. I don't think any of the other 3 secretaries of state would necessarily have been as steeped in the arts of downward loyalty as George Shultz. It's essential. A mediator needs air cover. A mediator needs a mandate. And if he or she doesn't have a mandate, you have to fight and struggle and renew and work hard to get that mandate. Because the parties won't take you seriously if you don't have a mandate. So I come back to that point again and again. One other ingredient I should mention, which made all this possible, is that we were shamelessly borrowing leverage from other actors in the international system. Shamelessly. We borrowed leverage from the frontline states, the African frontline states, who had been parties to the negotiation of Resolution 435. We borrowed leverage from our NATO allies in the so-called Western Contact Group. We borrowed a lot of leverage, and I'll stop here, from the UN system. This was going to be a UN-implemented series of agreements when it happened. And there were splendid people in the UN system who informally served as our interlocutors on a regular basis. I came up to New York 4, 5, 6 times a year. Some of my colleagues back in Washington wondered what the hell I was doing coming up to New York and spending all that time hanging out in the visitors' lounge or in the UN Plaza Hotel or whatever. Why are you doing that? Well, the reason I was doing that is because there are a lot of people in New York and around the UN system who know something about the brief. So it was a combination of ingredients. But you mentioned Cuba. We were unable to engage with Cuba until well into the process. We didn't start there. I've often wondered if it would have been quicker if we had. You may want to pick up on that point. I don't know if it interests you, but when the Cubans finally had had enough of this prolonged warfare in Angola, they had more troops at the end in Angola than we had in Vietnam, relatively speaking. When they finally made a bid, they actually sent a message through informal channels and said, you know, if we could join this process officially and formally, it would make a difference. It did.
They wanted to be taken seriously.
They wanted to be able to have their own competence as negotiators brought to bear.
Which you have acknowledged.
Yeah, absolutely.
And praised.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes people look back at this process and say, this all happened because of Gorbachev and Thatcher and Reagan and so on. This all happened because of individuals who wanted eventually to make peace in the South African structure, in the Angolan structure, and in the Cuban structure.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds very familiar. When when the El Salvador negotiations culminated, credit went to Gorbachev and Bush 41 also. Familiar with that?
Instead of where it should have gone.
No, it just wasn't quite right. I mean, the Soviet Union at the time wasn't really a significant a player. The Cubans were actually very helpful, as they were to you. And it was more or less at the same period, just some time later.
The Cubans fielded first-class people for this negotiation. They also fielded 50,000 troops, but they fielded them to get them out at the end.
Yes, yes. Now tell me, if you are able to the extent that you're able to, didn't you have to confront adversaries of getting them involved? I mean, adversaries in the U.S.?
Well, the short answer is yes, but it wasn't all that difficult by the time we got them at the table. We're talking about 1987.
Mm-hmm.
I started this process in 1981. It gives you some idea of what it was like to beat on that door for a long time. But as long as we could say that the Cubans are going to give something in order to get something,
Mm-hmm.
and what they gave as the price of admission was agreement in principle with the concept of total Cuban troop withdrawal. And of course the opening bid was like 4 years, you know, a 4-year schedule.
I see. All right.
But anyway.
Well, how about the question of engaging with South Africa? Did that not raise issues that were difficult to confront with frontline states?
Yes, but I
Southern
think
Africa?
there was a greater difficulty in terms of explaining this to the great unwashed in my own country. There was a sense in the United States during these years that the only important issue in Southern Africa was the end of apartheid. There was a sense that you could just sort of do that. Anybody who studied history would know that the way you get a regime like that to recognize the necessity of fundamental change is to remove the external environment that was as threatening as it was. I remember a conversation, this is not just about Southern Africa, our talk tonight. I remember a conversation with Julius Nyerere, from whom I learned a lot, back in 1981. And he knew that we were heading in this direction, that we would link Angola and Namibia.
Mm-hmm.
And he was obviously worried. Very, very thoughtful man. He was worried. He didn't think we could do it. He didn't think we were competent to do it. Some of our NATO allies didn't know if we were competent to do it either. But what he said was, we all understand in the frontline states in Southern Africa that Namibia comes first. If you get Namibia, then we can address, and we will address, the issue of apartheid in South Africa. That's the sequence. Strategically, it's got to be that way. It won't be the reverse. And of course, that's what happened.
So in a sense, you prefigured what the conclusion would be. In other words, if you gave, by giving Nyerere and perhaps other people an assurance that at the end of the day, what would come first was Namibian self-determination and independence, that reassured them and allowed other more difficult things to pass.
That's right. But until Namibia was independent and the Cuban withdrawal process had begun, there wasn't much likelihood of real movement in South Africa itself.
Right. Yeah. Yes. They had to be given their own assurances as well. Now, thank you for this walk down memory lane, Chet. I hope to pick up some of these threads later on in the conversation. Now, the real purpose of having come here is to talk about the challenges that are facing contemporary mediation. Now, you are yourself a scholar of note in the subject, notwithstanding the title of the chair that you hold, strategic studies, though of course you could argue that it's part of it, or that has to be a strategy in mediation to the extent that a mediator can produce a strategy that doesn't depend entirely on those who are participating in it, on the opposing parties. But do you believe that following the end of the Cold War, mediation has become a craft in many ways quite different from what it was during and before the Cold War?
It certainly has changed. I think the environment has changed significantly. The barriers to entry for mediators have collapsed. And as a result, mediation has become a much more crowded field. I don't think I need to say that in this room because there are many people looking around this room who've studied this and know it well. But mediation is today a much more crowded field. And there are lots of conflicts where you arrive in the capital city and you'll see various types of track 1, track 1.5, track 2 practitioners handing out their business cards. And you know, it's a little more competitive than it used to be. So in that sense, it's changed. It's changed in that nearly all of the conflicts we're talking about today, not all, but nearly all, are internal. And civil wars are different. The mediation I was involved in Southern Africa was an interstate mediation with profound implications for internal change in the different parties, internal change in Angola and South Africa and so on. But today's conflicts overwhelmingly are internal ones, so that's different. Why is it different? Why is mediation different? Because the mediator in today's conflicts has to answer questions about credible commitment. How do I give up my weapons if I have to live within the same place as my enemy? How many of my weapons must I bury secretly? How do we do security sector reform? Who does it? Then we have the whole justice agenda, which wasn't there really until the end of the Cold War. It was there, but it was not talked about so much. I am quite sure that the parties I was dealing with cut each other a deal when I wasn't in the room, that there'd be amnesty. I'm quite sure they did. They were smart enough not to tell me. But it's a different world now on justice issues. Many of today's conflicts are about political and institutional change, even transformation within countries. So the agendas are, in many ways, more extensive. I think the demands on mediators are, you need additional skill sets. I mean, I think just to be a little bit more concrete, I recall when there was a round of discussion about how to complete the process that led to the Sudanese CPA, which was signed in 2005. And one of the big stumbling blocks was energy revenues, oil revenues. Who gets them? Most of the resources in the south, but the export routes are in the north. And what the mediator did was, the lead mediator asked American experts who were kind of operating behind the scenes, how do we answer that question? And what the US did was to mobilize experts from the World Bank and from think tanks who knew something about revenue allocation, revenue management, revenue collection, revenue allocation. How do you answer those questions? And those are skill sets that are kind of important. So it's a broader range of skills.
I certainly agree with you. You alluded to one of them earlier when you were talking about the multi-party mediation. My inclinations there are on the arch-conservative side, you might say. My first boss at the UN, Mr. Perez de Cuellar, had encapsulated in a simple formula. He said that it is very important for mediation to be successful to preserve its unity and integrity. In other words, it must be clear who is in charge and who is essentially saying which way this has to go, ultimately. And he said this in the context of El Salvador negotiations, where we had formed this group of friends of the Secretary General, one of whom at one point took certain liberties that were not acceptable, and that could have had an undermining effect on the negotiation. That had to be straightened out at one point. So I've been skittish on the subject since. But in one of your most, I think it's the most recent book that you've edited or co-edited, Rewiring Regional Security, one of the trends that you notice is the formation of these sort of ad hoc mediation coalitions composed of sometimes astronomic numbers of participants. You don't actually advocate them, but obviously it's better than competition, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah.
Care to say a word about that?
Yeah, yeah. It's a good point. Multi-party mediation can come in several different guises. It can be sequential. So, one mediator does what can be done at a certain time, and then other people may follow in the footsteps. The Middle East peace process at different times has been a sequential multi-party process. Sometimes multi-party mediation is a composite of different actors, and I would argue that that's what we had in Southern Africa with the contact group in the frontline states. Because if you add all those up, that's 10 or 12 states were involved, as well as consultations in the UN system and so forth. A real coalition mediation is very tough to do. I'm full of admiration for what Kofi Annan has said in several occasions while he was, and then after he was Secretary General. He's kind of said when invited, I'll do it as long as other people get out of the way. That may sound just a little bit arrogant, but it's important, and it tells you kind of who's going to be in charge, even if there's going to be other people involved. When he saved, and I believe he did save Kenya from going over the edge of the cliff in 2007, 2008. He was not the first one to raise his hand. In fact, he was sort of recruited. And again, he said, I'll do it if. But then he got a lot of support from the UN here. People loaned him staff from the Africa division of DPA and that sort of thing, and from non-official, non-governmental organizations as well in Geneva. So it can be done that way, but I think it's important that there be someone who's understood to have the lead role, as you do.
Yes. Well, Berzequer took the attitude, and he took over as Secretary General at a time when the United Nations had very little business. There were 2 or 3 peacemaking or good offices issues in train. One of them was withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Another one was, he had Marty Ahtisaari working on Namibia. Cyprus, which had the UN had been running for a long time, and 1 or 2. Cambodia, but without the UN playing a protagonist's role. And there were a lot of people around Berzequer who were essentially trying to drum up business, in a sense, for the UN, using the word in a very broad sense, of course. But his view was always, if there's somebody else who has a viable and accepted process underway, we're not going in. It's as simple as that. We're not going in. So while the Contadora group was in charge of Central America, he just did not get involved and did not want to get involved. It was only when the Contadora group threw in the towel and asked him to take over that he took that on. But is there something that can be done? I don't know, some sort of a code of conduct that can be agreed on, or do you think we're condemned to having this kind of thing? Because my worry is that collective mediation, if such a thing actually exists, tends to blunt strategy and ultimately dilute responsibility.
It encourages forum shopping. It encourages the fragmentation of political parties. Parties decide that they might get an invitation to go and spend a week in Doha. They'll do it, and before you know it, you'll have lots of parties representing Darfuris or whatever, you know. So, no, it's really you need some discipline, but I don't know how you can do anything more than keep preaching this message. I'm not sure you can get treaties signed about it. I wouldn't want to see treaties signed about it, but it's best practice to have a focal point. To have a focal point, and I teach, among other things, and I have a course called the Strategy of Mediation, and one of the things I start with is when not to mediate. When shouldn't you mediate? And one of I've got about a list of 12 things on my when you shouldn't mediate. When you don't have a mandate, you shouldn't try. But one of the things on my list is you shouldn't mediate if somebody else is mediating and doing a good job, which is the Paris de Cuellar lesson. Yeah. But there's other reasons not to mediate too. I mean, sometimes what's needed is not mediation, but police action or something else.
Now, you've touched on a number of the specific characteristics of mediation today, and that already creates for a situation that the Kissingers of this world didn't have to deal with when they were doing this kind of thing. I don't want to name other names of other people who probably should have but didn't. But another issue that I might mention is the dealing with the past. This is becoming an issue. There is an emerging right, or at least it's described that way, certainly in the human rights community, the right to the truth of what happened to victims, internal conflict, massacres, genocide, that kind of thing. But that's creating a lot of public pressure, which is one of the new elements that one has to deal with perhaps more. I mean, leaks, it's more than leaks now. People demand to know as you go along, not necessarily a felicitous development. Do you disagree?
No, I agree.
And you've touched on sort of the having to grapple with the question of justice, which is not always convergent with the search for peace, and it's a burning issue today.
It's a very interesting dilemma, and you can set it up as a kind of debate between peace versus justice, and which do you privilege? But that is I think much too simplistic. I think maybe the first issue is whose justice, and can it be local justice? Can it be owned justice by the people who will be there? And there's lots of different models, as we all know, for doing this. But my bias would be towards local ownership, if that's possible. But the other dimension when I say whose justice is some conflicts have clear, I guess I'd say clear good guys and bad guys, or they have clear, some conflicts will lead to winner's justice, and some conflicts lead to shared justice or compromise justice. If you want to know why there was a Truth Commission in South Africa and negotiated amnesties for many people, it's in part because the South African transition was a compromise. But that's not true in every case. And in some cases, there's total victory by one side. So you have to look at the situation, I think, on its merits. Final point on this that strikes me, I would like to see the leverage that you get from the justice mechanism used for the purpose of achieving peace. That's what, to me, makes sense. So there should be someone in charge of when you apply this and how you use it strategically to get the parties to make peace. Rather than just saying, okay, well, the prosecutor has come along and he's indicted somebody and we're going to string him up if we can catch him.
Right.
You know.
So the South African approach, basically, where you are given incentives for owning up.
Yeah, but there are incentives for owning up, but that was a compromise agreement.
Yes.
Nobody won. Well, goodness and justice and truth and Rainbow Nation and all the rest, okay. But the African National Congress didn't defeat the National Party, and the National Party could no longer have ruled. So they came like scorpions in a barrel. And they still are.
If I could turn to another subject, which I believe also, in a sense, is characterizing it, or it may be perhaps too soon. With the end of the Cold War, you had the breakup of the Soviet Union. You had the very violent breakup of what used to be Yugoslavia. At an earlier point, Eritrea broke off from Ethiopia. Kosovo has now been widely, if not completely, recognized as having broken off from Serbia. Sudan has split into two. Before this started to happen, the tendency on the part of the international community, if there was one, was to discourage this kind of thing from happening. And that's why we had people who were conversant in the field of what you might call diversity management. You know, respect for minorities, autonomies, federal solution. Should diversity managers be adding a new tool to their toolbox? Are we going to see, do you think, in Africa, among other places, further breakups that are going to make the international community even more unmanageable?
That's just what Africa needs, is more states, right? I mean, just look at the map, right?
If it's just Africa.
It's not just Africa. I mean, right now, the biggest concern that one might have about the Syrian conflict is its capacity to completely demolish the map, artificial as it may be, of the Middle East, if it is not brought under some kind of negotiated control. I think there is a lesson in what the Czechs and the Slovaks did. I mean, if it's negotiated and it's a political process and it's agreed at the time, okay, I'm not averse to it, but that's very different from settling a civil war by saying, all right, we're going to break up the country. There was no choice, apparently, in Sudan, but that's another story.
Right.
Yeah.
Chet, since you mentioned Syria, which I hadn't planned on raising, can we talk about that for a minute? I suspect that might interest some members of the public here. That doesn't seem to be heading in a very felicitous direction these days. Is there really any prospect for a negotiated way out at this stage? What would it take?
To get a mediation to work in Syria requires a degree of ripening that is equivalent on the different sides, and there may have been a time when that was possible. It's more difficult now, I would argue. I've always thought, and I've written about this, that the way to get something done about the Syrian war is with the Russians. And it was interesting, it was kind of ironic that Secretary Kerry sort of backed into that, and the Russians grabbed. And then Kerry realized what had happened and said, yes, because what we were missing in the international system is a counterpart that we can get together with who can maybe orchestrate something with our various friends, their friends and our friends.
Mm-hmm. But isn't it the case that it takes more than just Russia?
It does.
And
Sure.
The U.S.?
Sure, it does. It's very complicated, but it's not going to happen at all unless you have a leveler playing field than we do right now. The dynamic on the ground is going in the wrong direction from the standpoint of getting the likelihood of a mediation to work. There's a lot of talk about Geneva II and getting back to Geneva II, but I think it's going to be difficult. But I don't rule out the possibility of a negotiated outcome in Syria. I want to come back to the Russia point for just a moment, because sometimes it's difficult to find a lot of incentive for the United States or any other single state to take the lead role as a mediator if there's no source of leverage. And what the Russians would bring in the Syrian case, of course, is leverage on Assad that we don't have. You know, right after the Berlin Wall collapsed, a number of my former colleagues in the State Department were suffering a severe problem, which I call enemy deficit disorder. And you can see that I'm still suffering from it a little bit. But sometimes you need to be able to borrow leverage like that and have another party that can help you to organize the playing field a little bit, you know.
Yes.
But it's a complex, very complex case. I think the real interesting issue here is whether the other way to go at this is with the Iranians.
Funny you should mention that. Yeah. Go on, Chet. I don't want to interrupt your flow.
No, don't you want to frame it?
Well, I mean, it seems to me, in all innocence, that Iran might be even more useful in helping solve the Syrian conflict, or at least defuse it, or decrease it, than Russia would be. And certainly the combination of the two brings pretty persuasive leverage to bear on the Assad regime. Though even that is probably not enough, because it's not just Assad now. The conflict in Syria has now been complicated by the partition of players that we don't usually invite to dinner.
No, that's right. I spent in the State Department 8.5 years of my life dealing with players that I wouldn't invite to dinner, and sometimes you got to do that. So.
Much as it, however unappetizing it may be.
However unappetizing. Exactly right. No, the Iranian thing is interesting because and many people have written about the word engagement, but they misuse the term when it's properly used in diplomatic practice. Engagement is not making nice. Engagement is not having tea. Engagement is testing the party you're engaging with, asking questions that party would rather not have to answer. And that's precisely what we have done historically with Russia. It's what we have done with China. It's what we did with South Africa. If you did it with Iran, they'd have an agenda, 3 or 4 major issues on their agenda. We'd have our agenda, and we would say, let's sit down and discuss our respective agendas with no preconditions and to see if we can work out a roadmap. On that roadmap would be regional issues of the kind that we're talking about. Regional security in the Gulf, support for terrorist movements, some kind of assurance that we're not seeking to overthrow that regime, even though it is eminently deserving of being overthrown. But let history take care of that.
Right.
You know, so you lay out a scenario, and that might be the other way to get at Syria, but it's very ambitious stuff, as you know. I mean, in our system, Iran is a very difficult account.
Well, the past weighs heavily, and
Heavy.
you tend to carry it around with you, whether you want it or not. And but isn't that what? I mean, the whole system of international relations, of the cement is provided by diplomats. In the normal course of events, you have relations with pretty much everybody without having to like them. I mean, the whole concept of you know, breaking relations, etc., seems to me, you know, it's sort of emotional, but not serious, serious way of conducting relations between states. And if you had such channels, you would be able to probe, as you say, engage.
Right. I hope you're all writing this down, because that's great stuff. That's great stuff, what Alvaro's just said. I mean, that's exactly, you've got to be able to have channels. Talking to somebody is not legitimizing them. Talking to somebody is an opportunity for you to tell them what you think and what your priorities are, and then if you're any good at it, to listen.
That's it. Yes, that's right. There you are. There's the practitioner, the practitioner side. The empathetic skills come out. But that doesn't solve another contemporary problem: is how do you deal with groups that, with which it is politically incorrect, if not legally dangerous, to deal with? Proscribed groups, you know, groups that find themselves on terrorist lists in completely different categories and guises. I mean, they're not all the same. They're not all Al-Qaeda, and they're not all the Shining Path. Some of them, you know, act mistakenly, but act on the basis of sometimes legitimate causes, and can sometimes change. How do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with that? Because we've gotten ourselves into a bit of a mess.
We have, yeah, we have. These lists are a problem. These lists of proscribed actors, and it's a way of disarming yourself if you refuse to talk to certain categories of people. It's unilateral disarmament of yourself. You know, what it does, I mean, take, for example, the question of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has a lot of blood on its hands, including American blood. But the fact that it's on those lists means that the only people who can talk to it are intelligence officers. Now, don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are intelligence officers. There's probably some retired or current intelligence officers in the room. Who knows? But
just leave immediately.
But I don't know if it's a good idea to manage your affairs in such a way that only people who are doing clandestine work can be doing diplomacy. Or only people who are in track 2 can do diplomacy. I'm not sure that's a very good thing. So I have problems with these lists. Now, I'm aware, as many of you are in this room, that there are ways to get around it. The Secretary of State can issue waivers.
On all cases?
No, not blanket waivers. They're case-by-case waivers. And would have to consult with Treasury about certain kinds of sanctions lists and so on. So it's bureaucratically complicated. It's different in Europe and different kinds of lists. My point is not that I want to always be talking to the most bloody-minded armed actors, about the future of their countries. But there are certain things you may have to talk to them about, like how do you stop the guns?
Mm-hmm. 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 What?
And how do you reorganize the security forces?
Yeah.
I don't want those armed actors to have a veto over the future constitution necessarily.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Right. Well, speaking of talking with everyone and reaching out and engaging, I see that I've invaded the time that is allocated for the audience here.
It's my fault.
No, not your fault at all. I would like to offer the floor if you have questions for Professor Crocker. There's a microphone here. If someone from the public doesn't take it up, I'm going to continue this conversation myself. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Yi Janai. I'm a second-year master's student at CICR. My question will be about the first remark that you said, Ambassador, at the beginning of your speech about the 1980s, beginning of 1980s, and how mediation was being perceived in the executive level of the United States.
Mm.
I'm wondering, did that observation of yours continued until the aftermath of the Iran-Contra scandal, where the Reagan administration tried to find a way to perhaps engage the moderate elements inside the Iranian regime? And do you think that even during those discussions in the Nations Security Council or the State Department, there was still lack of a strong perception towards the strength of mediation, or do you think there were still some perspective change in the perception towards the mediation as the 80s progressed? Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think over a period of time, as you saw diplomacy unfold in the Middle East and saw it unfold in Africa, saw it unfold in Central America, saw it unfold in Cambodia, which is the one case that Alvaro mentioned, that mediation became more accepted. I'm not sure it became accepted because of Iran-Contra, but what I'm suggesting to you is that I think our State Department, our Foreign Service, let me put it this way, when we got to the end point of the mediation in Africa that I was involved in, my team was nearly all career people, and one of the most senior of those career people said to me, I've never done anything like this before. And I've had 30 years in the Foreign Service. I've never done anything like this before, which was interesting. And another person who said the same thing was my Soviet counterpart, who I'll never forget him, sitting in my hotel room in Geneva on his fourth scotch. And he was quite a guy, this fellow. And he looked at me and said, you know, Mr. Crocker, I've spent my entire adult life trying to block everything that you Americans have been trying to do. And here we are actually on the same side. We're trying to get to a peace agreement. And it's the most exciting experience in my life. He said that. I mean, after 4 scotches, there are things you say, right? So, but what's interesting about all this is that mediation is not new. I mean, if you read Thucydides, you can find examples going way, way, way back. My favorite example is what Teddy Roosevelt did at the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, when he personally mediated the end of what was called, is often called World War Zero, because it was one hell of a war, the Russo-Japanese War. And you know, Americans, I know not all of you are American, but Americans ought to know that history. They ought to think of Teddy Roosevelt as something besides San Juan Hill. You know, they ought to think of him as a great mediator. He won a Nobel Prize for it, right?
And we're talking about macho material here. His manhood could not be called into question for having mediated that.
Right. pull it down.
We talked a little about the problem that you talked about before, which is the problem of outside negotiators and mediators meeting in somebody else's war. And how do you get those connections and links in place so that you have credibility to move those folks in the direction that you'd like to see them move?
Professor Licklider has written books on this, so he knows the answer to his question.
He's a good prosecutor material there.
You know, it's really a matter of developing an awareness of the cultures that you're addressing inside of a country. Being a good listener, being able to be sufficiently reliable, and I use that word advisedly. I don't think the parties in a civil war talk to you because they like you. They talk to you because they think they're going to learn from you something about the other side. This is strategic on the part of the parties. And they talk to you because they understand that it might be in their political interest to be seen talking to you. So there's lots of motivations at work here, and the mediator's task is made more difficult because you've got to be aware that some of the motives that drive parties are not motives that lead you to peace. They're motives that lead you to a different level of mutual understanding, but not necessarily to peace. I think you have to be able to be a good listener. I mean, that's the essence of it. And you have to be sensitive to the fact that there are many ways to skin a cat, and the cat doesn't like any of them. I mean, look at what's happened in Colombia, which I'd like to engage Alvaro in this conversation. Who is helping, which third parties are helping the Colombian parties right now to make the progress they're making, which is really quite impressive? They've looked at 2 of the major chapters of an eventual agreement, and they've gotten somewhere, I think. And they're still making forward progress. If you ask yourself, who is doing that? My answer would be the president of the country is doing it, but he's getting advice. He's getting some good advice. Would you agree with that judgment, that he's getting some good advice?
I'm sure he's getting good advice. Now, I'm very curious as to how it actually is unfolding. As I understand it, the Cubans and the Norwegians are actually present in the room. And I'm sure providing a lot of assistance. The Cubans are very good professionals, but the Norwegians have a lot of experience and expertise in this specific field, and therefore would probably have a lot to contribute. But I understand that they are using the single negotiating text method. In other words, that there is a text on the table to which they both present amendments, and somebody revising that text and bringing it up to date as many times as necessary until both sides can live with it.
Is it a mediation? Is it
Well,
really a
this is
mediation, or is it a Cuban facilitated?
What I have been told authoritatively is that it is a single negotiating text method. I'm just sort of explaining what I understand to be the single negotiating text method, which I've been using for 30 years or more, since the Law of the Sea conference. But it does require somebody who's actually doing that drafting, or cartloads of trust on the part of both. If it's the government that is doing it, someday we shall know. But in the meantime, one has to wonder. Now, I think I know where it all comes from. I mean, Colombia is acutely sensitive about its sovereignty, and there's been a long internal debate, I mean, dating back a long time. When I was doing the El Salvador negotiations, at the end of each negotiating session, the first press who always managed to get through to me, once or twice the BBC beat them, was Caracol, the Cadenas de Radio de Colombia. And they would always ask me trick questions, which I would usually manage to avoid, and about how can we do this in Colombia. I evaded those questions, but the point is that they've been debating it internally, and what has developed is a sensitivity and to what is seen as a potential external intervention. And this is partly because of the experience, the earlier experience in which I wish the UN had not been involved, which involved carving out a large chunk of territory where
the FARC.
The FARC, where they had sort of a certain freedom. They pretty much managed it. It was a sort of a Farkistan, in a sense, which they governed, and which didn't get anywhere. And there were a lot of external participants. So perhaps it has something to do with that. Can they pull off the whole thing without an evident third party, or alternatively, is there one that we aren't hearing about?
I think that's the interesting thing, and we can't really go into it in detail unless somebody wants to volunteer to do it. But there are third parties that we're not hearing about, and they are advising the sides at the table. We can be certain that the Cubans, who are extremely professional about all this, they have their own channels. The FARC is not their favorite Colombian rebel movement. The ELN is, but the Cubans, no doubt, are finding ways to communicate and offer thoughts and be a sounding board on the FARC side, and of course on the ELN side. But there are a lot of people that President Santos has mobilized to help him. And he is talking to people who are experienced mediators, experienced track 2 people. So, anyway.
It could be. But I suspect that a requirement is a vow of silence. Teresa.
Hello, I'm Teresa Whitfield. I'm an adjunct at Columbia, and I have the unique distinction of having written books with introductions by both Alvaro and Chet, which is and I is the only person on the planet, I think. I have a question. You haven't addressed, and it strikes me, sort of a new generation and the shifting panorama of conflict introduces a shifting panorama of challenges, and we see it in Colombia. But if you look at a couple of other very big, very complex processes, Syria and Mali, and I really don't know whether there's a huge attention and resources on mediation community, mediation support, the ramping up of the UN. Robert Downs here, head of the mediation support unit in the UN. Yes, I still don't know whether we, the broad community interested in practicing mediation, is really up to it in terms of the fragmentation and constantly shifting dynamics of the actors that we're involved in. I mean, being really blunt, because I know you both quite well, I mean, the days of the FMLN and the parties and the kind of the nice groups with coherent negotiating platforms and issues of leadership and people, the kind of those kind of groups as interlocutors have gone. And even in Colombia, where you have the FARC, and there is, as far as I can understand, there's a reasonably coherent group of people within the FARC who are conducting the negotiations in Havana. There are an enormous set of questions about moving forwards. Justice is a huge block, and what will happen about real fear that the violence, even if the process is successful, that the violence in Colombia will get worse because you have so many other armed actors. what proportion of the FARC will opt for a criminal path? How will they relate to other criminal actors? How do the interlocutors in Mali relate to the shifting dynamics of criminal organization, whether it's cigarette trafficking or drugs or a whole range of different activities? Similarly, in Syria, where the fragmentation of the opposition and the mixing in of jihadist and whole complicated networks of criminal activities across the different borders. I just wonder where these well-honed and practiced tools that you two have in different ways played a very important part in developing and writing, and a lot of my students here have read your stuff. I've inflicted it on them. But I think we're all being challenged by these new developments, and so I'm asking you what your wisdom and practice brings to that, and do you think we're up to it? Thank you.
Chet, over to you. You already touched on it in a certain sense when you talked about your class on when not to mediate, and you also alluded to ripeness. I'm giving you a way out if you want to take a way out.
Thanks so much, Teresa, for that question.
A depth charge, yes.
There are, of course, a wide range of cases that one could talk about in a conversation like this. I mean, one could look at, let's say, Nagorno-Karabakh as a case for mediation. And I think the Minsk group, which has the formal responsibility there, and a self-anointed trio, just not the right answer. The United States isn't about to make peace in Nagorno-Karabakh at the expense of its relationships with Russia. And Russians are not about to let this process go in a direction that they don't want. Because what they want to do is have both Azerbaijan and Armenia be dependent on them and keep them under some sort of control. So do the Russians really want an agreement in Nagorno-Karabakh? Hello? I'm not so sure. But there is coherence, at least some degree of coherence, particularly on the Azeri side, less so on the Armenian side. You could look at the case of Mindanao. Within the MILF, there's probably more than one voice, and there often has been a whole lot of voices in Manila. But my understanding is that there's more coherence there by a good deal than some of the cases that you mentioned, like Mali, for example, which is
multiple armed conflicts and huge amounts of criminal violence and organized violence and jihadist violence, so that again you run the risk of reaching too with the MILF and the violence and disorder and goes on. So
that's why we have special forces in Mindanao, because what we're going to do is kill them in collaboration with the Philippine forces, the people you're talking about. So, I mean, every situation is different. You can get coherence sometimes coercively. Other times you have to do it by waiting for things to gel. I think you're touching on an important issue, Teresa, which is that these conflicts risk becoming more and more fragmented the longer they go on. And what it tells me is two things. We need to get better at prevention. And that sounds like such a cliche, and we've been saying it about our work for a long time. But we really do. And prevention is possible. You can do prevention. I mean, take right now a case that is of great concern to me as an Africanist, among other things, and that's Mozambique. Mozambique is in a parlous situation, teetering on the brink of going back to its earlier troubled history. So that's one message. We got to get better at prevention, because once things start to rip, the tendency towards fragmentation gets more and more and more. The other message to me is that it's a good thing that we have so many great students who are studying this stuff and who are going to be the next generation of mediators and peacemakers, because I think we have a lot to learn.
Isn't it also an argument for getting governance and institutions right
Yeah, absolutely.
as part of prevention?
Absolutely, part of prevention.
Of course.
Yeah, yeah. Whenever you run into situations where somebody's ripping up the Constitution so they can have a 6th term or whatever, I mean, yeah.
Robert.
Thank you. Seeing as Teresa outed my presence here, I thought I'd better do a follow-up question. Robert Dan, United Nations Mediation Support Unit. My question was going to be the one that Teresa asked, because in classic ripeness theory, you need a mutually hurting stalemate, and part of that is to have parties with valid interlocutors who perceive a way out. And I think in the case of Syria, for example, clearly it is correct that on the one side, the challenges involved in bringing to bear those parties, both internationally and regionally, who have influence on the regime. But the other challenge, and I think the immediate challenge that prevents a process from starting, is the difficulty of producing a valid interlocutor on the other side for the Syrian opposition that is actually able to do business. And what is interesting about this process is that there is always a challenge of how much you reverse engineer this coherence. And so the Syrian opposition and the backers of the Syrian opposition naturally seek assurances up front of what they will be served in Geneva. And they're not talking about what's on the food menu. And to the extent that the international community has been able to do under Kofi Annan's orchestration, they have developed the Geneva framework that does actually lay out in quite a lot of detail how a Syrian transition would unfold. But of course, like all of these frameworks, it has that magical constructive ambiguity on perhaps the central immediate question, namely on how exactly you would handle the future of the president. And so the argument that continues to be made to the Syrian opposition is you have to turn up and test in Geneva what will happen in the dynamics of a negotiation. You have to set up a table where all these parties, including the Russians and the Iranians, are present and see where it goes. But, of course, that's a big risk to take if you are seeking to maintain your legitimacy as the struggling leadership of the Syrian opposition. And so I just think it's the question of how in the Arab awakening situation and in these places where you have all of the kind of situations that Teresa mentioned, you produce valid interlocutors who are able to do business, is a huge challenge for contemporary mediation. The other comment that I would make is that the question that Alvaro mentioned earlier of some sort of code of conduct of who should be mediating and when. I mean, I think in retrospect the Syria case is interesting because the UN only turned up to mediate that conflict in March 2012 when it had already been going for a solid year. Initially, the body that was seeking to mediate the conflict was the Arab League, which, if you think about the conflict for a moment, inevitably doesn't have within it enough of the elements to be able to mediate such a conflict. But it is an interesting case because I think the United Nations faces this in many regions, that the importance of regional organisations, their desire and their rightful place in managing conflicts in their region. But at the same time, the reality that there are situations which will overpower them and which more quickly should be moved to another framework. So I'm not quite sure what my question actually is, but it goes to, on the one hand, how you produce valid interlocutors if they don't organically exist, and on the other side, how you get better at prevention and early action in a situation where not only are states very sovereignty conscious, but also regional organisations are very backyard conscious.
Well, you've touched on two interrelated questions there that are. Shall I go ahead? Do you want to
Please.
reframe? Yeah.
No, this is yours.
There used to be an answer to your challenge about coming up with valid interlocutors. It was a terrible answer. the UN General Assembly would decide in its wisdom that they are going to anoint somebody as the sole and legitimate representative of the people of, you name it. And you know, that we can look at a number of transitions that have taken place as a result of that process. It does tend to unify the playing field, at least in the eyes of some. But I think almost any mediator is making decisions as you enter into a situation of conflict as to who. It's not about sides, it's about parties. We all know who the sides are in these different situations, but we don't necessarily know which party is the most valid interlocutor, which party you want to empower, which party you want to actually legitimize to some extent by addressing yourself there. I got into a lot of trouble for not talking to everybody in some of the conflicts I've been involved with. And my answer to that was, we'll solve one thing at a time. We can't solve everything at once. It's got to be a sequence. But that doesn't necessarily answer your question. When it comes to the regionals, and I think it's a good point that you've raised, I'm encouraged by the emergence of regional actors serving as self-anointed gatekeepers of a sort. I think it can help. It can help. Gosh knows the UN system is stretched. The big, powerful states are stretched. And if the regionals can actually play a role, obviously a powerful country like the United States can decide which regional group it will listen to. And we did that in the case of Libya. We kind of cherry-picked the regionals. And we got what we got, which is Libya today, right? Maybe we should take some more questions.
I was wondering, when political leaders declare that they're not going to negotiate or even speak with an adversary, what you think the rationale is? Is it a purely emotional decision? Is it an expression of moral outrage for domestic audiences, or is it more strategic? Like, is it itself a form of negotiation, or are they saying that they think they can get more through coercion than they can through talking?
You know, sometimes you run into this situation where people would say, I'll only talk to you if, and then the if is if you disarm, or if you give up, or if you forswear violence, or whatever. I mean, for years we've seen that syndrome. And what that really tells you is that the party saying it is not ready for negotiation, is not serious. You know, and saying that we'll use police powers, whatever, we'll do it our way. The government of Spain, and we have people in the room who know this case intimately, but the government of Spain has never wanted to admit even that there's indirect anything going on with ETA, for example, even though there is something going on with ETA, there has been, so we know that. And part of it is for domestic audiences, as you say, and because of the pain, the experience of the losses, and it's just, in democracies it's hard. Democracies find it really hard to make peace.
Elodie.
Hi, I'm Elodie Converne. I'm a PhD candidate doing research on the professionalization of UN mediation. So my question is to both of you, and it pertains to Ambassador Crocker's insistence that mediators need a mandate to mediate. And you both talked about the fact that mediation now is increasingly involved in civil wars, about the Colombian case where the state is sensitive about its sovereignty, and so there might be some third parties we don't know about because of this sensitivity of its sovereignty. And in this context, I was wondering if actually a mandate was not sometimes an impediment for a mediator to get entry into a state's internal affairs. As we've seen with the Secretary General at the UN, sometimes they've actively refused getting a mandate from the Security Council because they thought that this would make them look too intrusive in the eyes of the parties. And so in this context, do you see mediation evolving as still having a mandate to be able to enter into a conflict, or mediation without mandate as well?
I'll give a very short answer, but the experts sitting next to me here, I think you can use the word mandate in a number of different ways. Sorry, I'm having a technical glitch here. You can use the word mandate in a number of ways. It can be a formal, official, legal, transparent mandate, which in the UN case would come from the Security Council, presumably. But I don't think that's the only way it could come. It could come from the SG himself, could it not?
Well, the rule of thumb at the UN is that, well, first of all, the parties have got to accept it, obviously. And the second one is that you should have a mandate which can be tacit from a body having the authority to confer such a mandate. Normally, the Security Council, exceptionally, in the case of Guatemala, the General Assembly, which can bring its own complications, because if there's a follow-through, like a peacekeeping operation or something like that, the General Assembly is even more unwieldy than the Security Council at managing that type of thing.
Yeah, yeah. But I think mandates, leaving aside the UN, mandates don't have to be formalized in every case. The mandate that an individual might have acting on behalf of a, well, let's take a case of somebody that is known to at least some of us in this room, and that's the role that Jonathan Powell played in Northern Ireland. I think he was Tony Blair's chief of staff.
Yes.
I don't think it's probably any piece of paper anywhere in the British system which says, I hereby authorize Jonathan Powell to be my mediator between the parties in Northern Ireland. You won't find that formal, official, legal document. But boy, he had that mandate. Yeah, he had that mandate. In my case, I had a mandate because I was confirmed by the Senate, nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, but that didn't count for nothing. I remember when I went down for my hearing, the hearing was chaired by Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who welcomed me by saying, Mr. Crocker, I'm sure when you go home at night, your dog wags his tail. But I doubt if you can carry out President Reagan's policies. So that was the kind of, that's what I got from the U.S. Senate. The real mandate came from Reagan giving a long leash to Schultz, and Schultz giving me the air cover to do the job. That's what I mean by mandate. It's political support from above. But it can be legal and official. You may want to go in a different direction.
In the case of the UN, you need a lot of air cover, and this is an aircraftless organization, of course, borrowing on the power of others. I was going to ask you earlier, as a matter of fact, whether, I mean, you were talking about Schultz providing you with air cover. Was your air cover ever tested?
You mean
we will no longer deal with, we will no longer deal with Crocker.
Oh, all the time.
Ah.
Daily.
Well, it's comforting to hear.
Yeah.
Not just UN envoys get that kind of treatment.
Now, American diplomats spend about 80% of their time, Kissinger once remarked, negotiating with their own system. And leaving a good, healthy 20% for dealing with foreigners. No, I had to deal with Bill Casey when he was still alive, running the CIA, and he had his own channels to the South African military, so whenever I turned my back, we had liaison relationships with the South African military, and I felt like there were insects crawling across my carpet on a daily basis, and my job was to keep on from different agencies and different actors.
So the requirement for a mediator that someone was asking about earlier that you were addressing, I mean, the ability to listen and these considerations, what I call the empathetic skills, being in touch with one's feminine side. To those one must have, you must add air cover from a mandator with a spine of steel.
And you've got to care about it with a passion that is relentless. If you don't believe in what you're doing as a mediator, nobody else will. You can call it arrogance. You call it whatever you want. You call it stubbornness. You've got to believe in it. You know, I once remarked to my wife that I would have quit the job if there weren't so many people who wanted me to. I mean, it's that kind of thing. Yeah.
It's precisely because, so in other words, they steeled you even further than
right.
you needed to be. I think we have one probably last question because we've overstayed our welcome.
Okay, thank you. My name is Matilda and I'm from Uppsala University, Department of Peace and Conflict Research. And I was building a little bit on the mandate question and maybe getting back to both of your experiences, wondering if and when you have that political support and cover and the passion as a mediator, believing in what you want to do and what you do, what is the role of the individual mediator, you think, in these armed and complex political conflicts? What can you and other mediators and the mediation team members bring from their personalities?
I want to be sure I'm getting your question. You mean, how much does the personality matter of individual?
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. And you as an individual mediator in the process.
Oh, I think the field of mediation. I was chatting with Elodie earlier before the meeting started about the professionalization of mediation and peacemaking and so on. But I think that ultimately the success or the failure or the record of somebody will be a function of what they bring, of their skill set and their characteristics. And the characteristics of a good mediator, I've mentioned relentless intensity is one of them. You've got to be passionate about this stuff because it's actually hard and the odds of success are low. The odds of success are really not great. If all we did was wait until everything is ripe and then we go for it and then we get the Nobel Prize, I mean, that isn't the way it tends to work. So another requirement, I think, is some degree of cross-cultural interest in other people, in other cultures, other countries. I think the best thing I could have done to prepare in my own case is to be a student of history. History is a key. Languages are a key, even though I don't speak many. But even if you only have one other language than your home language, it gives you a terrific asset. The ability to listen.
Curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Insatiable curiosity.
Yeah. Why do you say those stupid things you say? Why do you keep saying these stupid things you say to the party?
There must be some other explanation.
Do you really believe that crap?
Well, Chet, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I'm sure everybody in the room has enjoyed it as much as I have.
I've enjoyed it too.
And perhaps we will find another opportunity to do it. And thank you to the public for having come today.
Thank you.
But